My, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from November's meeting.
I'll second that motion. Any discussion, anyone? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Meeting minutes passed, or passed, yep. All right. Okay.
Just moved around. You got it, Mike. It's see Terrence is with us to give an anti-displacement update, kind of how they're getting ready to form the committee. And then after his presentation, we will spend a good amount of time going through the report that we just released, as well as talking a little bit about engagement.
So first off, anti-displacement with Terrence. Terrence, you can go ahead then.
Right on. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, and glad to be with you on this Tuesday morning. Oh, great. Thanks, Sophia, for having the slides ready to go. So I just wanted to come back and update as we are about to more or less put out the call to get folks to be on the anti-displacement work group. I've been having a lot of conversations over the past couple of months with different folks, different representative groups. Hopefully this probably doesn't fully reflect what everybody wants individually, but maybe what everybody wants collectively, as well as sort of the best design process in order to sort of get to the outcomes that we want to get to. So going to the next slide, some core principles that we're really trying to get to that I think that really showed up in my conversations with folks. Obviously, the biggest one is that really folks want to develop recommendations that can be practically implemented, right? Nobody wants to sort of end this process with, well, this needs to be studied more, or here's just an abstract sort of policy or investment that can be made but needs to be refined. Right, there'll be some level of that, but more or less, folks want to get to a point where there's implementable strategy to address displacement. And this group is a core process for doing that. Number two is, I think which is a really big one, is to work through existing tensions between the various interests, right? So I think there's one thing for this group, say it was fully populated with community members. They come together, we ask them to do some really hard work and put themselves out there. But then sort of government sort of say, hey, thank you for your feedback. We'll take a look at this and we'll get back to you later. Like, no, I think what we'd rather have is for those tensions and those actual dialogue between different interested parties throughout this process instead of at the end of it. So I think that's a very, very key part. We've sort of been saying, how do we have the conflict during this process, not at the end of it? Number three, support community to take a deep dive into displacement while also respecting the business of their lives to be accommodated, right? So I think it's, how do we get to a nuanced level about any of the particular information that we're talking about, or into the particular policies and investments that we want to get to, also knowing that it's going to be really hard to sort of keep folks focus and attention over the life of this process. And so we designed the structure around that as well too. And then ultimately to develop structures around the group that will allow the group to develop clarity on ideas while also bringing along implementers for the discussion. So again, I think that kind of pairs with number two in a lot of ways, but right, we're here to support community to sort of develop a vision for themselves, but at the same time, governments will be implementer, philanthropy will implementer, private business interests will be implementers. And so how do we bring folks along for the discussion so that they implement the policy and investment ideas at its highest common denominator and not the lowest common denominator or anything that might exist between that. So these are four big things that I think we're really trying to point towards. Ultimately, the activities that will comprise leading to these things, I think are sort of centered around these four things, which is one, the anti-displacement group will be there to advise us on our research agenda and project organizing. So that exists, of course, we'll have a large research agenda, both quantitative and qualitative research. I've been asking the question, what else do we need to add? this group will really kind of coalesce and make sense of those things to make sure that research agenda is fully representative of community and other interests beyond that as well. So folks have the information. But then the other point is just, I don't at all want to confuse that as much as this group will hopefully be the demographics of the people who live. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought someone said something.
As long as there's a break, Terrence, can you answer a quick question for me?
Sure.
Back on number 2 on the previous page, existing tensions. Can you give me a brief example of what the current existing tensions are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, say one of the tensions is, which I think is a very clear one, is if community comes together, what's going to be different governments' commitments or level of support around the different policy ideas or investment ideas that come out of this, right? And so that's going to be, that's a tension that already exists, and so we need to design a process that works through that. Maybe a different one might be business interest and non-business interest, right? Might show up as a tension. It doesn't mean that people are in opposition with each other, but there just might be a tension, whether that's centered around trust or having a shared analysis around what the problems are, right? And what's, say within governments, what can be done at the local level versus, say, the county or the state level, right? Tensions aren't necessarily bad things, but I think they're just probably clarifying points for a large part. There might be opposition, and then where that is, I think we need to have the dialogue.
Okay, great. Thanks for answering that.
Yep. So, from that sort of research agenda and project organizing, we don't want to just leave it to Cura folks to make meaning of those research findings. For us to look at the data and then come back to the anti-displacement work group or the public at large and say, hey, this is what this means. Ultimately, we want to process with this group the research findings to make sense of them. Again, we don't want these folks to be like, we aren't solely going to be engaging these folks as if they are fully representative or have been laid out as representatives for their broad demographic groups. But of course, they could help us be translators back into, in terms of making meaning of the research findings, making sense of what people are saying and what we're finding, both in quantitative and qualitative data. And ultimately, right, the core part, really easy one, is making recommendations to address displacement within the Blue Line Extension Corridor, both policy and investments that the public and private sectors can implement. So we have, folks who do policy writing, the Housing Justice Center, which are both lawyers and policy writers here to sort of make sense of it within the context of Minnesota and local law, right? Of course, the governments are in support of that as well, too. So really getting to that point of like, can implement is a really important aspect of it. And then generally you have to participate in anti-displacement engagement to different interests on the project. I'll talk a little bit more about different roles for kind of different categories of folks who will be on the anti-displacement working group. So going to the next slide. So ultimately what we came up with was roughly, and I don't want like to be, oh, is there a question?
Yeah, I think you had a hand up from Felicia.
Oh, sure.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about the promise around this move for like policy changes or any kind of system changes. And so without making assumptions, it would be good to hear a little bit around, say, Met Council and Hennepin County's support or not in that area. I think that it will be really problematic to have these conversations about the possibility of like changes to like prevent stuff like this, those type of things, especially when it comes to policy or anything like that. Let's say one of the communities decides there's a certain ordinance or something they would like to see happen out of this. And I'm really wanting to know the entities that are able to make these changes. Have those conversations been had? How do we help community understand which level of what it is they're asking for or need?
Right.
And I'm assuming that's going to be in conjunction with the engagement folks, but I'm really like, I don't want to sit in a position even as a co-chair and make any empty promises to people. So can you talk to us a little bit about like what that journey is looking like right now. Like, where is the support? Where are places, say, us even on the business advisory committee can be having conversations or helping move this type of thing forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, the most basic at a practical level, of course, everybody needs to know is that, none of these governments have legal responsibility to follow the recommendations that come out of this group, right? And that simply won't exist. I don't know, maybe it can't exist in those different sort of things. But beyond that, sort of like at a basic level, understanding that, what I broadly feel and has been, I think, very consistently communicated to me is that, one, the governments are very in support of the creation of this group. We have a lot of, and we're going to sort of talk about the way that we're structuring within the context of governments. I spent a lot of my career working for some of these governments, understanding how they work, knowing how decisions are made. And so in the next slide, when I talk about the government representatives, I talk about how we're designing this process to be cognizant of those actual decision-making structures within these particular governments, right? And knowing, of course, so we can talk a little bit about that because I think it's going to help answer some of this question. So, one of the things that we went back and forth all the time about was, should there be government representatives that sit on this committee, on the anti-displacement work group? A lot of folks felt like no, a lot of folks felt yes. Ultimately, what we broadly heard, and even from these governments, that it's really important that these governments are not surprised by the recommendations that come out of it, but instead are in dialogue deeply with the anti-displacement work group and community along the way. And so ultimately made the decision that yes, each of the major governments, so other ones that may not be included in these 6 members, which I think there's still discussion about and would love to hear feedback, would be, should the state be represented at this group? Groups, say governments like the Minneapolis Park Board, be on this group. And I think there's some arguments in favor, particularly of the ones who are really focused on anti-displacement, like the Parks Board. But having a representative on this committee to be there, to hear from the community, to listen to the data firsthand. One of the things that's in the background, though, and just in this folks participating in the group, is sort of the structure behind it. So not only will there be one member that sits on from these governments who will be a higher ranking government official. We expect someone who has some level of authority, a broad sort of cast of responsibility within each of these governments. So not just somebody who might be a planner or someone, like, I'm not saying that those folks aren't good, but we want someone who can come to speak to this group with some level of confidence, some level of authority, but again, knowing the line that being part of this process doesn't supplant the actual policy making and decision making processes, right? So if they say yes to something in this group, that doesn't mean the same thing as saying yes. The government is actually implementing that. But behind them within the government, what we're asking them to do is to form a group amongst the other broader implementers within those governments, to be along for the ride, but not actually at the group. So we imagine that, say if we're talking about the city of Minneapolis, there will be a representative from the city of Minneapolis, but then also CPED folks, housing folks, planning folks, maybe policymakers are on this group as well. And we'll sort of have a mirroring process within these governments where we're bringing this data and information along the way, the discussion from the anti-displacement work group and community back, and really wrestling with them over the 18 months around these particular things. So like, we want to know, hey, well, if you want us to do this at the city, then you're going to need to change this law at the state. Or, hey, you're asking the city to do this, but it really is the county to be the responsibility of this. And then we'll go to the county and talk about that, right? Whatever those different things where governments may, sort of either say this isn't our responsibility or we don't have the ability to do this, to as much know that information and have that dialogue with the anti-displacement work group in the meeting, right, in those meetings themselves. So they're there to say, hey, this is what we feel we can do, this is what we feel we don't do, and for community to push back against that as well, right? And so we talk about their role primarily being to structure recommendations back to the responsible governments to get their inputs. And then, when the recommendations come and are put forward, to structure or to represent those recommendations through the formal policy making and implementing processes within those governments. and for those lines and those processes to be very transparent throughout this whole process, right? So I think at the end of this, what we really hope is that community has a very, very clear look about where these governments stand, that every appropriate folk within these government are there for the conversation to provide that feedback, and at the end of it to know whose responsibility individually to shepherd their recommendations through the process in real time. There's also some other roles about providing data and other information to the research team. We're really thinking about who are these people within government who have the credibility to move these, to say yes or no to anything, right? And for that conflict to happen in real time. And so while we of course can't guarantee, and there's no legal responsibility for these governments to implement these recommendations, what we think we're designing is the best process in order to have the real dialogue and to have these governments support, because we're caring for and considering what might be their technical recommendations around the actual delivery of these things, to get those really practical, implementable recommendations. So I'm trying to waste as little time as possible with anybody over these next 18 months. Of course, the biggest value that we can provide is transparency and accountability in the most direct way, without having the sort of the legal responsibility. Hopefully I explained that well. Felicia, I don't know if you have a follow-up question on that. If I didn't explain that well, please push me on that. But that's we're really, really thinking about how we can bring governments along the way, the highest level of transparency and accountability along the way.
Terrence, I just might add that on the county side, who I work for, they're obviously a supporter of and contract holder and well aware of the anti-displacement working group. So they've started to have conversations internal about how they can make sure that they're positioned to help support the ideas that come out of this. What kind of programs can they start to have available? What kind of funding might they have available to start to, hear, discuss, and implement the recommendations that'll come from this group? So hopefully we've carried the other parties along with us through this process, so they are ready as well.
Yes, so definitely there will be recommendations. Let me just run through so then y'all can see the whole picture, but yeah, definitely recommendations is great. That's absolutely. So then there will be 6 affiliated community members. I don't want to once again get overly concerned about the numbers here, because it's just a sort of a generality that we're trying to point towards. But of course we want businesses and nonprofits. Of course, we want folks who are housing in anti-displacement centered organizations, or businesses who are struggling to stay open, or maybe not struggling to stay open, but I think it's important to have the ones that are, because those are the ones that we already know are going to be the most at risk to closing, whether that's a result of construction or rising rent prices or whatever those things might be. But we want to find those folks who are vulnerable, who are working with folks who are very vulnerable, to be part of this group. So there will be this sort of, organization-centered role, and we sort of need to talk about the structure behind this and supporting that. But those folks are really there as affiliated community representatives to structure recommendations and interests from the organizations and partnerships that they're a part of back to the anti-displacement work group. So we know there's organizing that's happening in community beyond the process that we're formally leading. We don't mean to supplant that organizing that's happening in community, but to find a way for it to be to have a voice at this table, and so that there's once again not these sort of different interested parties that are dispersed around, but as much as we can to connect the research to those, connect our research and organizations back to those folks, and for those folks to recruit their members into the research and other participation amongst this project. Then, of course, we'll have non-affiliated community members, folks who aren't representative of anybody. But we want folks who, of course, are youth. We want the youth. We want people that have experienced displacement throughout the corridor, people at risk of displacement throughout the corridor, residents from jurisdictions within the Blue Line Extension corridor. Again, I want to note that we're not trying to fully engage the community just through the anti-displacement work group, right? We don't want to tokenize these folks and say like, hey, you are fully representative of youth, right? But we do want folks who can help translate from those communities, and maybe some of these folks represent multiple of these identities, But we're just really looking for 6, non-affiliated folks who are just in community to help us sort of translate and give direction to connect with the full community. And those folks will just generally be there. We're not asking for broader responsibility. Of course, the philanthropy will play a big role in the implementation. And so we want 3 members for foundations who are focused on anti-displacement, whose programmatic areas might be pointing in that direction, and are also, of course, serving the North Minneapolis, and near suburb up to Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park community. And their role is to structure learnings back to foundations and ultimately to find areas of opportunity for philanthropic support of the anti-displacement work group recommendations. We know, of course, not everything will be done by government, but philanthropy will play a big role. So bringing those folks along for the conversation is pertinent as well. So talk about those 21 members. Again, we're not like capping it at that, but this is just generally what we're pointing towards. And so, of course, looking for recommendations. We know we can fill this group up with 50 people. Like that, I think will be extremely easy to do, but I think it will be hard to sort of manage as manage as detailedly throughout. But we're pointing towards and trying to get the best group that we can. One of the things that we know is really hard is getting folks to show up for a meeting once a month, whether that's 2 hours, whether that's the beginning of your morning like this meeting is, or at the end of the day after you've worked. It's really hard to keep folks intentions. Just to answer your question, yes, youth, I think, I didn't have a hard line, but generally folks probably under 22. I'd guess, not, I think once you're after college, maybe you'd be considered in the broader adult population, but maybe following the juxta range of who they serve, but maybe even younger too. And I think that's around like 22, but I didn't have a hard rule. So any ideas about that, I would definitely take. So I don't think we can get folks to show up for 18 meetings and hold this nuanced information over time. And so what we really want to focus on is 4 full day Saturday meetings where we can really just have data and research deep dives. We can have speakers from government, community, and private interest, and discussion around policy and investment recommendations. There'd be 4 themes, right? Learning from existing blue lines and green line and previous blue line extension work would be the first Saturday meeting, housing and cultural displacement, business displacement, and finalizing the recommendations, right? And so we sort of think we think that this is a better structure than the sort of the every month thing, because folks don't come to every meeting, then they may not have the time and attention at the end of those days or the beginning of those days amongst their busy lives. Let's have 4 full Saturday meetings where we can really dive into these things, have the data, the sort of the testifiers and the discussion around the policy investment recommendations around a particular area. I think this will allow us to get to more nuanced discussion and really be able to hold information in a tighter sort of way, and recognizing the ability for folks to focus over time. And setting up those meetings, so going to the next slide, those will be sort of the big meetings, but we'll have some smaller meetings in advance of those, some smaller, like 4 1.5 to 2 hour weekday meetings, where those folks will advise on the research agenda. So in advance to getting to those big meetings, are we asking the right questions? Are we going to have the right information showing up within that meeting, within those meetings? And then, of course, the engagement around this for folks, so how do they want to hear from community, right? So there'll be these sort of prep meetings, and then one final 2 hour meeting, which is or to be the close. We can add more meetings to the structure, but we're going to let the anti-displacement work group make that decision for themselves. So say they want to focus specifically on, say, for example, Kira's rent stabilization report, right? Because that may be a recommendation that comes out of this group. That's great. We can focus on that for some aspect of the full Saturday meeting where that's the most relevant, but we can also add meetings as that group makes sense for them to have the information to get there. Or do we want to say the community members like, well, I want Hennepin County to give a more specific thinking around any particular policy issue. Let's call a meeting specifically around that. But we're going to let that be malleable and at the discretion of the anti-displacement working group members themselves when to call those meetings. So ultimately, having a smaller meeting structure, I think, with some big days, which will be heavy, we'll go all out, right? Childcare. I don't know whether there's going to be 3 buffets. I don't know. We're going to go all out for those meetings for folks to really be able to show up at those meetings. Of course, there's going to be a broader public process around this, right? So I'm just talking about the anti-displacement working group. This isn't the only time where we'll be talking in community. There is some talk about whether these full Saturday meetings should be public to some extent. Definitely want to hear y'all's thoughts about that, because I think it's a big time for community to really focus on these things, jump through these large topics while holding everybody's attention around those topics and getting to the recommendations. We can bring in a lot of experts to those meetings, all those different sort of things, lots of information will be great. So just the last thing, I know Sophia's rushing because I know you're going to get to the other stuff. So the application process is, so going to the next slide, we'll have the application of the big call out going December 20th through January 14th. We can go beyond January 14th, but we just want to sort of set some deadline for folks to sort of get those initial applications. It's a very, very simple application. It will not take a lot of things, but we're just going to get a sense of what people need to be part of the group, what affiliations they might have, if they already have an agenda, and I mean agenda not as a bad thing, but if they already have this policy or research question that's really important to them, knowing that up front so we can start building those things as we get these members in. We'll lead the interview process. We are hoping for at least one BAC and one CAC member to join us the interview process along with myself, Dr. Lewis, and 2 of our organizers on staff. And so we'll just sort of call those interviews as the applicants have availability. There'll be a large media campaign. We'll be working with a lot of organizations to get this word out, to get folks to apply and to get in the door. So both online and in person, there will be availability around that. With the broad hope being that the first meeting happens in early February. Possibility it could happen in late January, but just throwing out sort of the latest timeline being early February. That will be a smaller, one of those 1.5 2-hour meetings where there's really an orientation and solidifying the research agenda. So queuing up a lot of stuff. It'll be a really kind of painless application process, but I'm sure y'all will see it and we'll get the word out there. And hopefully the smaller meeting structure is more palatable for folks in the community versus committing to something once a month for the next 18 months. So yeah, so that's what I had to present. I don't know if there's any questions. I know you'll have a big agenda, so.
Yeah, and I'll also encourage the chairs at this moment. We can always follow up an email, but because we are gathered, if there's interest in serving on the review committee for the applicants, the anti-displacement working group with C. Terrence and team. If anybody is interested, maybe expressing that now and seeing if the committee agrees with that appointment. If folks need to think about it, we will follow up in email to get a representative from this group. So kind of leave that on the table right now to see if anybody is interested in helping facilitate that process.
Great. All right, thank you, Terrence. Appreciate that. And if anybody wants to, they can always put it in the chat. They decide, or they want to decide later, they can contact Sophia. So let's roll on to number 4, draft report overview from Dan and Sophia.
Sounds good. And Dan and I are gonna, before we fully transition, just really encourage folks to help C. Terrence select the anti-displacement group. And it sounds like we'll follow up officially with an email from the committee to get the person identified. Jumping into the route modification report, Dan and I are going to kind of present concurrently, though he has a meeting that he's going to have to jump to, so it'll be a little bit of a tag team. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of information in the report. This presentation is going to be a little dense. I'm going to read a lot of words, but I think the overall message is that we have a good project and some good decisions to make as we go forward. So kind of just jumping into it, like what is this thing that we're doing? What is this draft route modification report? And it's basically the culmination of all the work that we've been doing with all of you since a little bit before March of last year. So, in March, we actually put out routes, asked folks if they were right, all that kind of stuff. All the work and things that we've been asking you through that process is really documented and incorporated into the report and the analysis, as well as all the engagement efforts that we've done kind of with the broader community to shape values and look at issues. Obviously, it provides an overview of the technical work, like we were saying, and the main piece and what we're going to go through in more detail is if you kind of think back in time for quite a little bit ago, one of the first questions to this committee was to look at the project goals. And we discussed, were they meeting what the community thought? There's a broader engagement effort. So we'll kind of go slide by slide, looking at how these routes actually stack up against the goals that you all helped shape. Each goal, it has a rating, and that's what we're going to spend our time on. And it's either excellent, good, or poor. If you're receiving a poor rating, it means you were unable to meet the goal, so the project wasn't meeting it. If the goal is good, it basically meets the goal and provides benefit. It doesn't mean that there's no challenges, but just that the challenges that we're identifying are not insurmountable, or that through efforts, even like what Terrence was talking about, we can amplify or mitigate for those challenges. An excellent rating means it really, really met the goal. We'll kind of go through all the things that feed the goals. But if it's excellent, it's really meeting all those things, or has a unique characteristic, or really the potential to deliver exemplary positive benefits in that particular area. So goals, their rating, that's the focus moving forward. And we're going to do a lot of talking, but hopefully it helps with everybody. So just a quick reminder, and I won't read them now because we're going to go through them one by one, but these are the 6 goals. A lot of them have to do with just the transportation basics of this project to the greater community benefit that this project can bring. Before I go through the areas, the area 2 and area 3, where we have either we're verifying our route or we have route options, just want to acknowledge in Brooklyn Park, and Brooklyn Park does extend into area 2. I got a couple questions yesterday about that. But because the 63rd station is in area 2, it was on freight rail property, but on the portion of their alignment on West Broadway, basically just confirming there are no changes. The stations in Brooklyn Park stay the same. The recommendation is consistent with the project principles. Those areas very much still meet the project goals that were previously looked at. And it also allows the city to maintain and build upon all the transit-oriented development work that they've been doing thus far. So a lot of synergy there. The first goal, which is to improve transit access and connect to jobs and regional destinations, there's a few things that feed that goal. So ridership and the ability to expand service, especially we're looking at to those that don't have cars. Reverse commute. So not only is it for folks in our northern communities to get into the city of Minneapolis, it's for Minneapolis residents to be able to access Robbinsdale or Crystal or Brooklyn Park. So that reverse commute and being able to do it kind of throughout the day. Opportunity to expand transit and multimodal opportunities. And then it's really connecting to those regional destinations. I think you guys all remember that we've asked about the destinations that folks want to connect to like multiple times through that process because that is a major input to this goal. So our findings in area 2, basically the route is excellent. Both the 63rd station, which is kind of off this map in Brooklyn Park, as well as the Bass Lake Road station, basically provide very similar access from our previous project and connect jobs and destinations that folks are really getting to. In Robbinsdale, obviously downtown Robbinsdale is a really important area to serve, as well as North Memorial. And that station at North Memorial also offers the ability to connect parts of North Minneapolis in our park system. For Lowry Avenue, this also achieves an excellent, this is basically the Lowry has a lot of goods. This is where it does achieve an excellent rating. And one of the biggest reasons why is that it serves neighborhoods with limited or no access to personal vehicles, low income houses, and high percentages of residents of color. There is destinations along the way, including potential future development. And one of the features of the Lowry route is that it's almost a mile longer than West Broadway, and thus has a couple more stations. So you'll see in some summary tables coming up, just more, you pick up more people because you have potentially more stops. However, some of those stops are very constrained by the freeway as well as the river. So kind of quick summary table on that effect. You see kind of populations at all of those stations, some of the jobs, you know, in kind of the North Loop area and kind of pulling through, as well as those zero car households pulling through our station stops. West Broadway also meets an excellent in this category, and partly because it's really serving the commercial and cultural heart of North Minneapolis. We've heard a lot from folks about how West Broadway is where they go to spend a lot of their time, access a bunch of businesses. There's cultural destinations such as the Juxtaposition Arts or the Capri, and that just like Lowry, you are serving folks with without cars, or also a high portion of residents of color. So this is kind of the summary table with that, and kind of very similar message to Lowry in where you're picking up folks. Still a lot of jobs as well. West Broadway has, you know, a commercial district as well as a couple major employers. Going on to goal 2. And it's improving the frequency and reliability of transit service. And, you know, you're both trying to improve the ability for folks that are currently riding with Metro Transit to increase their mobility, help them get around town faster in more places without transferring and all that kind of stuff, kind of that regional network, as well as attracting new riders. And you're looking to expand and improve the efficiency and connect to the metro system. So, but with that, you're also considering how the improvement in transit potentially impacts traffic mobility as well. So kind of looking at the whole picture of how people move around. Our findings for that, for area 2, this is again an excellent, providing a dedicated guideway really helps with that service. It improves your frequency and regional connectivity. You know, we've heard folks, for example, in Robbinsdale that want to get up to Brooklyn Park. And you hear folks in, you know, just as they try to think about how they navigate the metro region. So this really helps. While we do need to continue to work with safety, with the cities of Robbinsdale and Crystal to address, you know, specific concerns about safety or traffic, overall the level of service is stays fairly the same, and that's why we get that excellent rating there. You know, I'm moving really fast. It's really dense information, but I just hope that it just shows kind of all the work that we've done in this realm. For Lowry, this achieves a good. You are definitely improving transit service, especially those people kind of moving across, and you're providing connections to our metro line. There are traffic changes with this route, and that's why it doesn't say get the excellent score. You have unsignalized intersections along Lowry that become right in and right out, so that's a traffic change, as well as roadway changes on Washington Avenue that have to be considered. On West Broadway, kind of going into that, you're improving overall transit service. You're adding a metro connection. You're getting people to regional destinations. This route in particular has the ability to attract new riders. While you're serving the cultural heart of North Minneapolis, you're also providing a very efficient kind of travel path. West Broadway is very much that, as well as just our connections to our other metro lines. And then just acknowledging that part of the challenge is that with the lane reduction on West Broadway, we do add potentially some intersection delay that we'll continue to work through if this is the route selected. Dan, do you want to do a couple before you have to jump?
Sure. I know I certainly have 15 or 20 minutes. So good morning, everybody. So Sophia covered the first couple of goals of the 6 goals that we have, and I'll cover the next few here that talk a little bit about, that identify some goals and how each of these various routes measure against those goals. So goal 3 is really about meeting FTA new starts criteria. It's kind of a goal that says, how can we maximize transit benefits while at the same time providing a project that's cost competitive, economically viable, meets the demands of a good operating system and minimizing operating and maintenance costs in the future. How do we get that balance where we're not spending so much money and not seeing the benefit in the end? And so when we look at area 2, when we look at Crystal and Robbinsdale, again, this starts with the primary recommendation here is that we are proposing a project that runs at grade in public street right away. That minimizes right away acquisition costs, that minimizes construction risks, that minimizes long-term maintenance and costs associated with things like tunnels and structures and pieces like that. The building an in-street running LRT system is something that Metro Transit knows well. We've got a lot of that type of system out there today. And so how to operate and maintain and run that kind of a system is certainly very cost competitive. It also minimizes buying. Like I say, it minimizes buying lots of additional right of way because primarily we're almost exclusively using the street as the location for that. As we continue to advance the project, we believe that these routes have, especially in area 2, has ways that we can effectively kind of develop this so that we balance capital and operations costs. Here's an example. We're proposing primarily center platform stations. And so with a center platform station, you've got you don't have the duality of having to have ticket vending machines and signing and all of that on 2 spaces. You're able to consolidate passengers and provide that at a single location. Also very familiar operation for customers. Lowry and West Broadway, essentially really the same. These are the same primary pieces along both of these. And so really it's about, this goal is, it's not excellent. There are challenges associated with all of the street running construction, and it isn't all street running. We have some of this will be on structures. We've got bridges to rebuild, but essentially this alignment now from Target Field Station all the way up to Target North Campus in Brooklyn Park, with the exception of a few locations where we need to build elevated structures, it's primarily a street running system with center platforms that we're able to maintain and provide adequate cost effectiveness in the New Starts program. They all 3 segments rate as good in our report. Let's talk about goal 4. Goal 4 is around an LRT system and a transit system that helps support communities' development and redevelopment goals. So part of what informs this then is the likelihood of transit-oriented development or redevelopment opportunities to be there in the station areas, that both capacity, the availability of development opportunities are there. And then secondarily, are those areas ready for that kind of development or redevelopment, because those kind of developments would be consistent with approved plans and policies that the municipalities have, including additional affordable housing, prioritization of transportation connections and transit opportunities there. So in area 2, we find this as excellent. We believe there's definitely economic development opportunity up at 63rd in Brooklyn Park, in and around that station area. And we've been working a little bit with the city of Brooklyn Park already on that. Moving down to Bass Lake Road, the city has already done some TOD work in there, did some streetscaping work on Bass Lake Road, did some, did the work on Becker Park to help improve that. As that area comes to station area planning, and we look at both the opportunities that will come from some of the right-of-way acquisition necessary for the construction work down there near the station. We believe the opportunities are there. Robbinsdale as well. Currently, there have been, between the Hy-Vee and Parker Station Flats and Birdtown Flats, there's been new development and redevelopment already that helps support and move forward an LRT project. And there's currently discussions going on at Elam Church and at the US Bank site and at other areas. And so public and private investment is likely to occur already. Much of it has, as we move forward during construction and after it's open. So we really believe that the 81 corridor between the south end of Brooklyn Park all the way down and through and including Robbinsdale all has areas around the stations that would be excellent for redevelopment. On Lowry, similar, we're close to, not necessarily adjacent to the Upper Harbor Terminal, but certainly we know there's a tremendous amount of economic development opportunities there at the Upper Harbor Terminal, as well as possibly along some of the Washington Avenue corridor. Lowry doesn't have quite as many potential. It's a lot of single family homes that aren't necessarily in need of economic redevelopment, but there are development and redevelopment opportunities. There's vacant land out there. There's other land owned by Hennepin County and City of Minneapolis, and so that have opportunities. So this is rated as good, not excellent, but good as an opportunity for redevelopment along here. West Broadway, on the other hand, is much more, in our minds, ready for redevelopment opportunities. Sophia, you can go to West Broadway. We see this as excellent. This is the heart of the West Broadway Business District. We have talked to numerous community organizations that we believe have goals of revitalization along West Broadway, creating new opportunities, potentially around the station areas, building on what's already been done, the improvements like the Capri and others. If you drive along West Broadway today, you'll see construction in numerous sites going on. So that's already happening. Obviously, the biggest one being, the housing that's being built on the curve there is part of already redeveloping opportunities along here. And then there just are numerous undeveloped parcels and vacant parcels, some owned by public entities like Hennepin County and the City of Minneapolis, that have that opportunity for development and redevelopment. So we believe that this is part of the community goals to revitalize the West Broadway Business District, and LRT can help present the catalyst to do some of that work. So we see this as excellent.
Dan, before you go on, Jimmy asked a kind of question in chat of like who we've been talking to. And I just want to use this as an opportunity of that we would specifically like to actually connect with you to talk more. We've been kind of going up and down the corridor, talking to various stakeholders throughout this past month, from just individual businesses to bigger organizations. And we do need to connect with you specifically, Jimmy, about all the work that you're doing. So let's connect and get your thoughts on this report and all that kind of stuff. I think it'll be good to have a discussion, as well as just kind of continued conversation with stakeholders along the way.
Perfect. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks for that. Okay, so we got 2 more goals left going into goal 5. Goal 5 is around climate change. Goal 5 is around healthy communities, environmental practices. So how are we minimizing impacts to natural and cultural resources, parks and other historic and cultural resources along here? How are we putting connections in at stations that get us to that get us to healthy food, to grocery store options, to things like that. Are we building elements into the project that provide the necessary sidewalks and trail connections and accessible access that helps people be able to get around and not have a station over here and a community over there separated, but no real good route to connect the two? So are we including those pieces, and are they there? And how are we potentially reducing greenhouse gases through reduction in vehicle traffic and vehicle miles traveled? So as we look at area 2, again, providing LRT in the County Road 81 corridor minimizes overall environmental impacts. We're not going on new properties that don't already have transportation facilities. So it allows for much easier opportunities to provide bike, pedestrian type of connections. We are, by building what we consider to be green infrastructure here as an electric train, working towards hopefully implementing and advancing both the state and Hennepin County's climate action plans, which includes the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled. So that helps along that area as well. We provide access to grocery stores and the regional park system, but also have to be sensitive that we're working around numerous parks, and how will we mitigate the impacts that go into those. So some benefits, definitely some challenges in terms of working through the environmental review process. Strong connections to Becker Park, strong connections to other neighborhoods along the area 2. So this evaluation rates as good.
There's a question in chat, and I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I can clarify the question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I love the presentation. Thank you guys for sharing this. I guess I'm curious to know, with my engineering background, sort of from a data perspective, how you guys arrived at some of the good, better, best recommendations. And I'll just use the development one that we just went through for an example. It was said that West Broadway was rated excellent versus Lowry being good. And I'm not disputing it one way or the next. I guess I'm curious to know sort of what is the criteria in more detail for making these recommendations, because in this, or I guess what's driving the recommendations, because I think it's like telling 10 people to draw a circle, right? Interpreting that is going to be done 10 different ways. And I don't know, when I think about development on Lowry, just from being a developer and this being my day job, I see more readily opportunities for people who look like me on Lowry, simply because I know that most of West Broadway is owned by a few gentlemen in the neighborhood, and there's going to be limited, and the ones that are not owned by the gentlemen are owned privately, and are those the folks who I personally know are waiting for the big holdout. It's like I'm waiting for the light rail to come through so I can cash out. So again, I don't see, from my lens as a developer, I don't see that many opportunities for me as a Black developer who lives in the neighborhood to participate on West Broadway. I see participation because I see vacant land on Lowry, which again, so I guess I'm wondering, like, have you guys, I'm more of a sort of numbers kind of guy. So like, have you guys calculated like the amount of vacant land available on Lowry as opposed to West Broadway to arrive at these recommendations, or are they based off of sort of subjective? I mean, I guess it's objective and subjective, but I guess I'm wondering if there's a methodology or assumptions that how you guys are arriving to these recommendations. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure. So, jumping into the report and kind of going through the various data points that pulled out this recommendation, I think might be helpful on this front. You're kind of looking at, I think you actually hit on a bunch of them. So, we looked at vacant land or underutilized land, or kind of even the future planning and goals, as well as just just the overall picture of both corridors. So I think you kind of hit on that, Dan. Anything you want to add with that?
Well, I think that that's this is a very good question in terms of the fact that on each of these goals, and if you it takes more than our PowerPoint, but an actual dig into the report to see that we did use quantitative measures, real numbers with real measurements to arrive at some of these, and we definitely used um, qualitative or more subjective, objective observations to arrive at others. So it's a little bit of a mix where we had some quantitative things that we could use to make these recommendations. We did that. So I can't remember directly right now. Did we actually pull out available parcels? And I'm not sure. We said, yeah, this route has 72.1 acres of potential redevelopment area, and this one has 65. Not probably not something to that detail, but we looked at and counted up number of available parcels, and then just some of it was the feel we got from our public outreach over the last year about where opportunities were, where people were thinking there made sense, and what some of the existing land uses were, as well as our work with the city about what were the existing land uses, where were those opportunities, and what was what they were thinking about in terms of zoning around the various areas. So it's a little bit of a combination of all of them as we move that forward. With the one that I have on the screen here, I mean, some of these are, were there actually access to some of these areas, and but not, and you'll see some talk of reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Our modeling shows how building LRT influences traffic, and that was a quantitative measure about the expected VMT reductions associated with LRT construction. So a little of both as we pull this together.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you correctly, there was quantitative and qualitative data, and some subjectivity in there. What I think would be helpful, because within that discernment, right, some of it is your own personal bias. Subjectivity is personal bias, whether we call it it or
Understand?
not.
Absolutely.
And so I think in quantitative versus qualitative are two different data points. So I think it would be helpful to have some transparency in those. Where are we calling out quantitative data? Where are we calling out qualitative? And where are we being subjective and making assumptions? I think will be helpful, because somebody like me who's reading this is like, and I think where Jimmy's question might have stemmed from is like, well, my lived experience is something totally different. And I'm not, again, disputing that 20 other people, because I'm just one person in the community. So I'm not disputing that maybe you talked to 20 other people who told you something totally different. But I think it would be helpful to call out where we're pulling this data, so that when people read through it and they raise their eyebrows because it doesn't necessarily jive with their lived experience or day-to-day in the work, I think it would be helpful to understand, like, how did you guys arrive to this assumption, so that I can insert, well, here's my ism to add to it, to provide more feedback as a community member. I think it would be helpful to.
Yeah, and I tell you, we would love. I mean, as a project team, we would love those comments and feedback on, if you will, shared experiences and lived experiences that people have, and that they know. I mean, there are certainly times on qualitative measures where others will know more and have a different lens than we have, and if we pull in that information, that's part of why we want to do this as a draft report with evaluation findings that we've found or that we believe to this date, And then certainly if there's disagreement that, well, that's not how we see it, that helps us understand what the real factors are, or another lens, if you will, so that it all starts to build together to the actual really what's going on and what then results in the best end product here as we pull this together. So that's great feedback.
And I'll offer to Dan to just kind of take over where he's presenting right now, so he can jump to his other commitment, but also just really want to highlight the last part of his response to that, which is the intentionality by not having a recommendation in this report was to give the opportunity to basically verify with the community that we're not missing anything in our interpretation of the data and the lived experience. So,
Sophia, I'd also like to add that if anybody takes a look at the report, takes a look at the goals, and says to us, we think this quantitative measure that you could arrive at, you could go somehow get the data to support that, could really help inform this goal. Those are good recommendations as well. We picked ones we thought would help get to and inform the goals, and we worked with our project teams to do that, but certainly we didn't capture all of them. And so if there are some out there, those are good recommendations as well. So I'm going to move over. Sophia, thanks for taking over from here. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, thanks, guys.
okay, all I know we're going through a lot. I do want to leave time at the end. I think we've heard two major topics today, and so just kind of giving Mike and Felicia not just what we talked about, but some good things for the CMC to consider as they deliberate on this will be good uses of our time. So kind of continuing with goal 5, which I'm going to go back to the goal because just in case the conversation you kind of forget what we're talking about, but we're talking about promoting healthy communities and sound environmental practices, particular efforts to address climate change. So really looking at kind of the community cohesion, ability to kind of get ways efficiently and reduce vehicle miles traveled, which helps with the greenhouse gas emissions. So we kind of covered area 2. In area 3, on Lowry, you would be able to provide that overall roadway improvement does very much meet the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled. You provide access to grocery stores and regional parks along this route. And then there are potential environmental, social, and cultural resources impacts that we'll have to kind of continue to pay attention to and make sure that we're mitigating as we move through the process. And it's from things from direct impacts as well as just kind of like thinking about your watershed and all that kind of stuff that we have to look at as we go through this particular goal. On West Broadway, it's very similar. You're potentially providing the improvement to the roadway. You are able to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. We are able, that West Broadway does capture a little bit more of extent of reducing the vehicle miles traveled than the Lowry route. And that's partly just kind of your who you're attracting to the system and things like that. But part of the consideration, the Lowry route also has, the West Broadway route also has connections to kind of grocery stores and regional parks, as well as multiple commercial hubs. Regarding goal 6, advancing a local equity and working towards reducing regional disparities, this is kind of really getting into the economics, and kind of, I think this is, a really in-depth one to look at. And you're really thinking about what are those opportunities to invest in historically disinvested communities. And really, since this was a question that kind of came up, like, what did you look at to kind of consider this? And one of the data points that we definitely pulled on was where have there been historic patterns of policies that made it harder to build community wealth or for for example, home ownership and that kind of stuff, and we'll kind of pull that forward. There's overall community cohesion and kind of the connection to cultural assets and the opportunities to kind of honor things through this, and then kind of the minimization to short and long-term impacts to property access, etc. So kind of a big one. And kind of with this, an area two, we find that is good because it provides an opportunity to locate an LRT in an existing facility. So again, you already have a transportation corridor, so stick an LRT in it is kind of consistent. You don't necessarily impact the community cohesion, maybe in some ways improve it. And you are connecting to the regional transit system and jobs. The metro system is also a really big part of it. It's just that providing that connection allows folks to access kind of the broader region and jobs. In the there's communities of color and low-income communities and various things that fall under the environmental justice category throughout the whole corridor on Blue Line. So that's part of what we're looking at. On Lowry, kind of finding that it would have the potential to support community wealth building. There has been a previous disinvestment, and the kind of some of the challenges, are looking at impacts to parking up. One of the things you kind of have some places, especially along Washington Avenue, where you're having trucks parking, and it's a kind of a service to the community in a sense. And so working through all of this is going to be a big part of moving forward. On West Broadway, it's kind of similar things. You're providing that access to a commercial district. This map that is on the screen, it could have been also shown in the last slide, shows some of the homeowner loans and how some of that worked. And so in the red and yellow areas, it was places that at the time made it very difficult to get mortgages, and thus some of that building that home ownership and value was impacted. Under the West Broadway route, obviously preserving those cultural assets, as well as just all of the businesses that are along the corridor, having multiple design options that work to minimize impacts is a big part of how we move forward and how we're successful. So with that, here is kind of the overall rating matrix of how these routes stack up. And, I think the overall message is, any of these routes are viable. Any of these routes would do well. And so it is really getting into those details to come forward with a recommendation in the next step. Trying to take a breath because it's a lot of talk and going a little fast. We do have for your networks some in-person and virtual community meetings to get the broader community kind of into this data and having reactions to it. We are taking comments through January 25th. So there's a 45-day comment period plus, and that'll then inform the final route modification moving forward. So I would really encourage everybody on the community, this committee, especially because many of you represent developers, organizations, various business entities, that your comments during this period are really, really important. So I think it would be really nice to connect, both hear the discussion within this committee and also connect kind of individually, whether it's a meeting or I would encourage folks to really submit comments. So with that, I am going to stop talking, trying to catch up if they missed any comments in the chat. There is a comment form online right now. People can still submit comments on the interactive map. But one of, you don't need to just use interactive map. There's kind of a whole comment form in this phase 2. If there's kind of almost to Chris's point, there's very kind of complex thoughts and questions about, the data and how things are stacking up, we also are taking comments officially through email as well. So kind of multiple ways to give feedback on that front. Chairs, I will turn it over to you for any discussion or points that the committee really wants to bring forward to the corridor management committee.
Okay, Sophia, question here, and I put it in the chat room. So the city signed off on this first, and because we're BAC, we're kind of in a bit of a vacuum here. Yes, we hear some from the community side, but there hasn't been a lot of dialogue. At least I haven't had a lot of dialogue from cities and understanding where Crystal, Brooklyn Park, the city of Minneapolis, Robbinsdale are hitting. And, ultimately we can recommend all we want, but if the city says no, it's like a dead end. And have you addressed some of those hurdles if there are any?
Yes, I mean, I think we're working with all of our corridor cities. I think everybody is very open to the process that we're in right now. The cities kind of saw the building of this report. This is also their time to, if they just choose to give us comments and kind of get into the details a little bit more as well. So kind of to your question of like, have they signed off on kind of the overall analysis? And I think you referenced this table in particular. We definitely took input from our city partners in developing it, but just like you, they're also reviewing this report and shaping their thoughts to move forward. If that makes sense. We didn't necessarily ask for official sign off and blessing before publishing the report.
And this, I would assume, needs to go to each city council for ratification, correct?
So we would not anticipate bringing like the report to city councils for ratification. It's more the partnership to identify the community supported route. The kind of official step in terms of adopting the project is through municipal consent, which will happen a little bit later.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions, comments, suggestions, concerns?
I definitely want to reflect that heard from kind of the in discussion about how West Broadway has a few large landowners, and that could be a barrier to implementation. And so having us think about that in terms of really realizing these goals was an important consideration. Any other thoughts from the group that we need to make sure that we're pulling in and reflecting?
Doesn't sound like it. Speak now, please, if you got anything. If not, Felicia, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I was actually, this is KB. I was wondering who exactly is choosing the anti-displacement board?
Sure. So applications are going directly to CURA, and the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, led by Terrence, and their staff will be reviewing those applications to basically form the committee. We want one representative from this group to basically review the applications with them. It's a little bit of a time commitment. They anticipate kind of interviewing the folks to make sure that they're kind of committed to the work. Be really important, I think, for the anti-displacement table to kind of retain the people that are there, as well as making sure that various entities and groups are represented. So that was rambly, but to kind of sum it up is that we'd really like participation from this group directly, so representing the business community in that selection process. But it is being led by C. Terrence and staff at Kira.
Thank you.
And no, I didn't have any comments at this time, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody else. It's 9:20. We had 10 minutes left, which is good speed. I'm looking forward to the meetings next month, Sophia, and if y'all can make them, it would be wonderful to see you there.
Yeah, I was gonna say we have a little bit of a November engagement overview to provide for the community, and so we can do that and maybe like a 2-minute version, just because I think everybody's heard a lot of discussion and information. And since you teed us off already, I'm just gonna skip to it real quick, which is our next meeting would actually be January 4th, but we are recommending probably canceling our January meetings at this point. And the reasoning for that is that we'll be in the middle of the comment period for the draft reports, as well as still in the middle of the process for selecting the anti-displacement working group. So we won't really have any major updates on that front. And it would be nice to kind of preserve the time to really connect with individuals and organizations to get them comfortable with information, or not comfortable, that's not the right word, abreast to all the information in the report, so that everybody has the time and ability to kind of provide any substantial comments that they want.
Sophia, this is Felicia. Sophia is, and I know you haven't given the engagement report yet, so it might be in there. What I'm wondering is, similar to like November, where I believe we did we cancel our meeting in November? We canceled a meeting in 1 month. I can't remember which month, but there was just a lot of engagement happening. And then I felt like we even got like a bit more updates around like the different opportunities for us to plug into some of those engagement spaces too. Will we have a bit of that as well for January? So since we're not meeting as a BAC, but there are still like those different opportunities across our areas to stay engaged, both from a learning standpoint, because engagement activities are really great spaces to learn, but also I found it helpful being on the BAC and being in some of the engagement spaces, because we're able to relay a bit more different information and context around what our work is here. So that exchange goes really well as far as like really having a discussion about this project. So my question was, will there be like lots of opportunities or plenty of opportunities in January? And will you all be able to like get us, updates on what that schedule is, or things that are happening that we can tap into?
Yes, I think November is going to be a very, very heavy month for engagement. And it's kind of a little bit right now of trying to start to really fill out that calendar of events. So we do have kind of what I shared on going back on this slide of some kind of pre-programmed events, both virtually as well as some in each community. And then, really wanting to basically have time with a lot of the organizations, individual businesses, neighborhood groups, kind of name the list, all the stakeholders, so that we can get some really meaningful comments on this draft report. Having you have an initial reaction, and that's enough, right, to give a comment, or just spending time with staff and asking questions so that you can provide multiple page comment as well, whatever kind of feels right to folks. But definitely that is the kind of convening and holding spaces with the community so that we get the most meaningful feedback that we can on this document is really the goal. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does.
Thank you.
Okay, in just the couple minutes, I'm going to not really read all these slides. I think you've heard me talk quite a lot during this meeting, and I just want to say, like, overall in this report, basically, you know, almost a year's worth of work and engagement has gone into shaping it. And just most notably is we've had about 270 events during that time, and that's resulted in over 9,000 points of contact with the community. In addition to, you know, sometimes those one-on-one conversations, which doesn't necessarily make that total a lot bigger, but those one-on-one conversations produce some of the most meaningful analysis that we bring forward. So again, have thoughts, reach out to me. I'll reach out to you. It would be really good to have more discussion as we move through the next December and January. And you know, in the report, there's kind of a whole section where we've kind of pulled forth a bunch of the community issues that we've been hearing. I'd say to kind of think of the overall corridor and some things that we've been hearing, just the making decisions through the lens of fairness is one that really, you know, people really kind of have said in different ways, but have really pulled out. Obviously, property impacts, it's often the focus in Minneapolis, but just overall, I'd try and asking the project team to minimize any property impacts. And then business support during construction and pedestrian and overall safety is something that we hear corridor wide and will need to be a big part of our work kind of moving forward. I'll kind of skip through things, but we've pulled through various themes by various activities that we've done. Like we've door knocked pretty much most of the corridor. And, you know, like, for example, when we were talking, just kind of door knocking, hearing something that Chris kind of brought up earlier in the call, which is there's a lot of small businesses along our routes. And if development happens or reinvestment, how do they individually kind of benefit from that work versus, you know, a major landholder or something like that? We had stakeholder check-ins, and those West Broadway came up quite a bit. But even just talking to individual specific property owners that could be impacted in various ways, you know, different reactions. Some, you know, really want to stay exactly how they are and not like any form of impact. Some could wonder if there's redevelopment opportunities, and others potentially thinking of how to better meet their needs with a change. Since we're almost out of time, I'll just kind of end it there. But just want to know that kind of to echo Felicia, this and in all of your work, please encourage your networks to think about what they think of our routes and provide that comment. And we want to facilitate with you really getting some meaningful feedback in this phase that'll really kind of make a difference to how we step forward.
All right. Anybody have anything else? You're at 9:28. Good job, Sophia, keeping us on track. That's it. Everybody have a great holiday, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, everybody. We will follow up an email to see if anybody wants to help with the anti-displacement selection, and expect. I think. Well, I didn't hear much concurrence. I think it was concurrence about canceling our January meetings. Got a couple of chats of people saying that they were actually unable to make January as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.